We can't surround ourselves enough with people who are not like us. I think it's critical that we surround ourselves by people who have had different backgrounds, who've grown up differently, who have experienced different careers. Because when we're working on something together on a team, they will bring up things that you never could have imagined.
Hello and welcome to the Unlock Lab. I'm so glad you are here. Today, we are going to talk about the value of immeasurable things with my guest, Benjamin Wolff. We are going to be talking about the talent pool within organizations and how it's time to think differently. We're going to talk about why the arts and artists are essential to the future of work. And this is based on his book and his thought leadership. Before I dive in, let me just pause and say if you're new to the Unlock Lab, welcome. I'm Tosca DiMatteo, the founder of Tosca Coaching and Consulting, and I do work to help folks get out of their own way at the intersection of personal growth and professional breakthroughs. If you want to learn more about me and my services, please visit CoachTosca.com. That's Coach TOSCA.com. Today is such a treat. First of all, because Ben Wolff is just an amazing, gorgeous, generous, beautiful human being. And I'm just honored that I had the chance to meet him through the National Speaker Association and through Gene Stafford, who spoke at one of the chapter meetings. And long story short, this is how I got to meet Ben. And let me just give you a few words about Ben before I hand it over to him to introduce himself. Ben, as I mentioned, is a Forbes Leadership contributor, writing about what corporate America can learn from the arts. With his background as a professional cellist, he also brings a unique perspective to the conversation around business finding value in untapped pools of talent. He has delivered innovative programs on creativity, teamwork, and emotional intelligence for companies and organizations such as Cisco, the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, and Rockefeller University. And I could go on, but I just want to say that I love your background. I love that you've been in the arts and now you are in the arena of talking to corporate leaders and changing that world through your experience. So I just want to pause and pass it over to you and ask you to walk us through, your journey as a musician and now in what you do these days. I love hearing about those windy roads of career. And I know the audience does too, because it just serves as inspiration. So thank you so much for being here and making the time for this conversation. And I'll just pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tosca. I'm really excited to be here. And I think you've basically said everything that needs saying. You've introduced me, you've done everything else. Now, I can talk a little bit about my background and how it influences what I write about and what we're talking about today. I think that's the important part. So, growing up, my background is coming from a family of artists. And it's not just my parents, who both are artists, but my cousins are all artists. My aunts and uncles are all artists. We have no doctors. We have no lawyers in our family. It's very unusual. It's almost completely artists. And I think the reason why that was important to me is that I got a sense for the life of an artist and what creativity really means. A lot of people, they appreciate the arts, they enjoy the arts, but what they get is the product. They go to the theater and they see a play, or they see a movie, or they hear a concert, or they see a ballet. But most people, unless they're connected professionally in some way, never see what goes into it. The craft, the process, the weeks, months, years of process that goes into it. So I think growing up, I had this real insight into what that took. So, of course, I was very involved in music from an early age, played the cello, went to college. I was at Columbia in New York and was a passionate student of history. I was a history major, but also studying music seriously, studying cello at the Juilliard School. They had a joint program at the time, which is still going between Columbia and Juilliard. And I was super fortunate that my teachers in both institutions appreciated what I was doing in the other. And this was very unusual. And it really made everything that has come since possible. That my music teachers appreciated what I was doing in academics and that my professors in college appreciated what I was doing in music. So I had that interdisciplinary start to it. I graduated, started freelancing as a musician in New York, eventually found myself as a co-founder and co-artistic director of a concert series in North Carolina, in Winston-Salem. We were in residence at the Renolda House Museum of American Art. And the reason why I bring that up is that we were performing music in an art museum. So our audience was surrounded by art. And for me, it was this incredible opportunity to talk about music, to program music in relation to visual art. I was able to give like a pre-concert lecture and walk people through the connections between what they were seeing around them and what they were hearing. And again, another example of that sort of interdisciplinary nature that I was so interested in. So the festival lasted for about 10 years. When that was over, I was still freelancing in New York. I was teaching, but I started a music and science show that I toured with for about 5 years called Galileo's Muse. And it told the story of how Galileo, this famous scientist, turned to music to solve one of his most important scientific problems. And not only was it a super fun show to create, to tour with, but at a certain point, someone came up to me and said, this is really a performance about creativity, even more than about science and music. And it really sort of sparked something in my mind. And he said, you need to take this stuff to the corporate world. And I had no idea that those sort of talks, speeches, workshops even existed. And that's eventually how I found myself in National Speakers Association, creating presentations that connected the arts to business through, as you said, emotional intelligence, through creativity. Then, after a number of years, in 2017, through a very generous introduction of a colleague, I found myself writing for Forbes about what corporate America can learn from the arts. And in many ways, I was primed by my history for this moment, because here I had the chance to really explore this idea through another lens. And that was as a journalist, interviewing people in business and the arts, going beyond myself and finding that there actually was a whole world out there. So after a few years of doing this, I had the idea to put all this information into a book. And the book was published a few months ago, and you've read it. And here we are recording a podcast today.
Oh my gosh. First of all, I grew up also surrounded by music, but not in the people making a living out of it, right? Like I went to School of the Arts. We had this conversation when we first met, and like being surrounded by it, and like walking in the halls of my high school with like people singing and like dancing. And like I realized it's a very different way to grow up and to be exposed to people being creative, to people using those strengths. And in your case, right, being used to seeing people make a living out of it. And it makes me think of this exposure is everything, right? Like what we are exposed to becomes part of what we think might be possible for ourselves. So I love that you share that, like, it didn't sound like there was a lot of barriers for you to pursue the thing that you loved, being being a musician, being a cellist. But tell me, I just like to pause on this. Like, did it ever occur to you like, oh, maybe I'm going to have a hard time making a living doing this? Or was that not really at the forefront of your mind growing up?
So interesting that you ask that. I think every artist at some point in their career, early on, middle, they have this thought that this is a challenge. And I think it's particularly challenging in America, which has never been super friendly to the arts as a career. There isn't the kind of government support for the arts that there is in Europe, let's say. And I think one of the reasons why I'm interested in this topic is that coming from a family of artists, it was sort of natural that it was deemed something important on the same level as any other career. And the challenges of making a living with it are very, very real. And not just growing up, but actually having colleagues who have dealt with injury, who have needed to change careers, dealt with career setbacks. I realize how important it is. That's from the artist perspective. Then we can also talk about, the opportunities from a business perspective. But I think every artist, especially today, needs to think about this and think about the possibilities.
Yes, I love that. And I think that everybody, this is going to be a little bit of a side tangent, but I just, for you listening, everybody has skills and talents and creativity. And as you mentioned, like in the corporate world, and we'll talk deeply about this, it's not something that is in the fabric of that world or encouraged even if you think about new ideas, right? Like those are really scary in like corporate environments, like, but that if you're listening to this and maybe it's bringing up a longing for the thing you used to do or used to be passionate about and you haven't done it in a while, like also trust what's coming up for you, that maybe there's some unfinished business or maybe there were some limiting beliefs that you had, that now it's time to say, what else is possible here? Because I think our whole conversation today is really about what is possible, not just for us navigating careers, but also what's possible for organizations to shift the way they think and the way they do things and the way they find talent. So I just wanted to drop that thought for folks to pay attention to, because I think that we often ignore those voices that are kind of showing us the way. Which reminds me of the other thing I wanted to bring up in your beautiful intro, Ben, which is you talked about that somebody planted the seed with you about, hey, maybe you should do this inside corporate, right? I love that you shared that, because I think that there is this, I don't know, conditioned belief system or whatever it is, that everything comes from within us, and like we know everything within us about like what our path is and should be. But also, I think that when we pay attention, when we're really listening to the people around us that are reflecting our skills, that are showing us this is really special, that if we are paying attention enough to listen, we can really find our path in that way as well. And it's a fine line between people projecting or whatever and actually just taking in the reflections that other people are sharing with you. And I love that you shared that part of your story, because clearly that made a really big impact for you.
Yes, absolutely. And we can't surround ourselves enough with people who are not like us. It's so easy to be around our own tribe, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. But, the ideas get stale. And I think it's critical that we surround ourselves by people who have had different backgrounds, who've grown up differently, who have experienced different careers. Because when we're working on something together on a team, they will bring up things that you never could have imagined. And of course, that circles back to the whole theme behind my book, which we can talk about. But I completely agree with you there.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. First of all, I'm nodding my head frivolously, because that's always been a part of my DNA, which is like surrounding yourself with people that are different from you in all the ways. I think that especially today, when we look around, like, yeah, if we're feeling stuck, obviously this podcast is all about how do we get unstuck? And if you're feeling stuck, this is just a beautiful idea of like, well, maybe invite somebody that's different from you into your world for a little while. You can get new ideas, right? New thoughts. So I just really needed to highlight that, because it's something that we can say, but actually letting it like embodying that and really taking action and saying, yeah, like maybe I do need some different thoughts. Like maybe the friends that I've had for 20 years and the colleagues I've had for 15, maybe I need something else. So I just want to put that out there. And yes, and let's dive into the book. I'd love for you to share with the audience why this title, The Value of Immeasurable Things. Can we start with that?
Sure, absolutely. We can start with the title. It's the way the book begins. The word immeasurable is not used very often, especially in a business corporate context. And what people are more comfortable with or more familiar with is unmeasurable. The quote for the book came from someone I was interviewing, actually, who said that. And at the moment, I thought, this is just a wonderful phrase. And it kind of pegged itself in my brain. And then when I came to writing the book, I realized this was really the heart of it. So to me, immeasurable is different from unmeasurable in that it's something that not only can't you measure, but that shouldn't be measured. So, for example, at a certain point, human beings didn't know, let's say, how far the moon was from the earth. It was unmeasurable. And then we achieved a certain level of knowledge where that distance was actually measurable and we knew what it was. But then there are other things that I see as immeasurable, things like love. Can you measure that? Should you measure it? It's ridiculous to measure that. Or beauty. These things are immeasurable. Not only can't you measure it, but you shouldn't measure it or even try. It just makes no sense. And the reason why I chose it as the title for the book is that in the corporate world, often people are focused on metrics, what can be measured. It's understandable. Business runs on profit and loss and numbers. But I think what's lost often is that just because you can measure something doesn't mean everything should be measured. And that's why I called it the value of immeasurable things, because the arts and people with a background in the arts are very familiar with things that can't be measured. Things like beauty, elegance, taste. These are things that are integral to the arts, but you can't measure them. And we're going to talk more later about sort of the kind of skills that artists bring with them. But often those particular skills are also not measurable and shouldn't be measured. That doesn't mean that they're any less valuable.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I love that we just like naming it, right? Like organizations have such an overemphasis on metrics and measurable things, which is why, sidebar, right? Humanity gets lost because how do you measure the how of what you're doing in the work in terms of kindness, in terms of collaboration, like those types of things, right? Don't get measured. And that's why I think we're in the state that we are in corporate, because these things that actually have immense value and contribute immeasurably to reaching goals get sidelined because either we don't know how to talk about it, we don't know how to be fair about it, for lack of a better word in this moment. But to your point of immeasurable things, I know that in the book you talk about, well, artists get this, creatives get this. So can you talk to me more about, okay, there's this situation in corporate where maybe this isn't really an understood concept, but then there is a whole lot of people that do get that. So can you tell me more about that?
Sure. Let me do it by talking a little bit about the kind of skills and qualities that I think artists or people with a serious arts background bring to the corporate world. There are many of them, but I'll just pick out a few because I think when one can talk about tangible examples, this all makes much more sense. So let's start with the big one, creativity, imagination. Every business wants creativity. It's at the top of what every leader wants from their people. I think artists understand creativity as a process and a discipline and a skill. And to me, that's very different than, let's say, people going to a weekend corporate retreat and learning about creativity. Artists have studied and practiced a craft for decades, let's say. And so the process, the discipline of creativity is built into them. So that's one. Second, let's say something like storytelling, which is actually incredibly important and not an easy skill to teach. But if you take someone, let's say, who comes out of the theater, who has a real sense of what makes drama, what makes a narrative journey, all of a sudden they're much more able to help with a corporate story, where their project started, where it's going. It's an unusual skill. Something like, let's say, focus. You have, let's say, an artist or a musician who has become used to spending 5 hours in a practice room practicing their instrument. I have examples of someone in my book who had that background and became a world-class cardiac surgeon. So for him, there was a very direct line between being able to focus on practicing the piano for 5 hours and being in an operating room focusing on his patient's diseased heart and fixing it for 5 hours without a break. That's a direct connection. But then you have things like interpersonal communication. These are things even in my own background. I remember as a young high school student, as a cellist, doing a summer program studying string quartets. And this is, very unusual, but our coach, our director, gave all of us this book, Getting to Yes, which is a very well-known book, comes out of Harvard about negotiating. And here we were, teenagers in a string quartet locked with four other people for 6 weeks in the summer. And we had to learn how to negotiate. We couldn't go to another group. We had to practice. We had to rehearse. We had to move forward towards a concert at the end of the summer. And there was really no other option but to learn how to negotiate. So then you take someone who starts at 15 and maybe has a 20-year career playing in an ensemble or being in a theater group or a ballet troupe, and they learn negotiation. They learn how to communicate without words. So important. Then you have things like, let's say, embodied knowledge, where you have a musician or a dancer who understands about their body. That's a kind of knowledge that you can't get any other way. And that's incredibly valuable these days. So I could go on.
I love that you're bringing this up. And just for you who's listening, right? In corporate, there's been this bifurcation between folks who are analytical, right, in a certain way and a way of doing things in corporate, which has a huge gap between a whole other way of doing things and a whole other type of skill set in creativity, in the arts, and all the things we're talking about. And they've been separate for years. So we seem to be in this moment of how do we do things differently in corporate? How do we make sure we're looking at talent pools that maybe we haven't considered before on many different fronts? And so I'm curious for you, Ben, like, why in your mind is this an urgent topic right now? I have my thoughts, but I'd rather hear, like, why do you think it's really important right now in the world?
Absolutely. And thank you for that. I mean, to me, it all comes down to where we are, let's say, with AI and robotics. I mean, these are our issues of today, and it affects everyone. And if you think about it, the skills that AI can't do are just the skills that creative people, that people with an artistic background bring. Things around listening, emotional intelligence, making meaning. These are things that we used to call soft skills, which is an unfortunate term. And I think they really should be called human skills now. Core skills. These are the things that it's very hard to teach. You can learn about the specifics of a job, but those other skills you take with you from experience to experience, from job to job, they become part of your core. And I think that's why it's critical for corporations to think about who they hire. If companies are going to be hiring fewer people in the age of AI, then they want to be bringing the people they do hire who have the widest skill set possible, especially in these human skills, these core skills. And that's why I think they need to rethink the pool of talent that they're drawing from.
Yes, that makes so much sense. I also refer to it as human skills. So, like, let's co-create a book called Human Skills. It's where it's at.
Yes.
um, but yeah, right. Like, it's actually the human side of our capabilities, our ability to connect dots in a way that can't be replicated in some algorithm. I don't care what they say, right? But these types of things that the workplace is going to need more than ever, because
Yes.
some of those analytical functions, right, can be done differently with AI and other sources. All right, let me just take pause for this content really quick and share a message from one of my generous sponsors. As you know, one of the things I do here on the Unlock Lab is to help you get to know yourself better. And one aspect of this is understanding how your energy works. That's why I love human design. It helps you understand your energetic blueprint so you can come back home to yourself. If you'd like to learn more about your unique energetic signature, my friend Holly does this incredible work, and she's an amazing person. You can go to humandesignbyholly.com to download your free chart to find out which of the 5 human design types you are. If you're wondering, I'm a generator. You can also visit her website to book a one-on-one reading. These unique readings will help you understand your personal energetic signature and so much more. Here's the great thing. Holly was super generous in giving Unlock Lab listeners a 25% off discount when booking your first reading. For this discount, use the code UNLOCKLAB, one word, all caps, when booking at humandesignbyholly.com. For the link and the code, see this episode's show notes. All right, now back to our conversation. And I hope you take a look at what human design is. I think it's pretty cool. And I'm curious too, it feels like the way that we look at talent is extremely antiquated and archaic. And as someone who you've obviously had different roles and different, right? You've been a leader in different ways, whether you're putting concerts together or what have you. From your perspective, what do you think about the status quo that you're really trying to get at in shifting? Your legacy, for example, the legacy that you want to leave behind, like what is the change that happens because Ben Wolff has been out there beating the drum about it for 25 years?
Well, that's a huge question, but I'll narrow it down a bit. I think companies need to think broader about diversity. Diversity is more than gender or color or income, those typical things. It's about background, it's about people's experiences. And it's not only people with an arts background. I mean, that's my area. That's what the book is about. But take someone who comes into a job search, who shows up on your radar with an unusual background. Maybe they come from a family of farmers, let's say. This has nothing to do with your work. You don't have any idea, but they bring with them a whole world of experiences around that might be incredibly valuable. So I think that these days, it's very easy to rely on, let's say, AI to screen thousands of digital resumes. Because I understand recruiters, people in HR are just inundated these days. But I think there needs to be some way for people to recapture the human element of recruiting. It is a challenge, and I'm not diminishing that. But I think if we can understand the possibilities of talent out there, then we can find a way. And just to give you a example, I wrote about and interviewed a husband and wife who founded an organization called Artists Who Code. They came out of the Broadway theater background, and eventually they moved into software engineering. And they realized that there was no on-ramp for people from this kind of background to get into software engineering. And so they founded an organization to really provide that sort of on-ramp to people. And one of the things they told me is that in the earliest stages of interviewing, the people who are doing the interviewing are looking for the safest applicant possible. They don't want to go outside the box because it's risky for them. Then if the applicant makes it up the ladder several levels, then the leader is actually quite interested in someone from a different background. So I think the challenge for organizations is, how do you empower the first round, the lower level recruiter, to take the kind of risks in hiring that a leader will appreciate later on? I think you just have to make it risk-free for them to take a leap and do that. It's not obvious, but I think it can be done.
Yes, absolutely. And I have to ask this question just because, this is what I do. But, you talked about how, at one point you realized, oh gosh, I can help bring creativity into these other spaces. And like for you, where does the passion come from for helping recruiters, managers, organizations think differently about their hiring practices? Like, what is it for you that makes you tick about this?
I think, it comes from both sides. So from an art side, growing up in the arts, being around artists, going through my career, being around colleagues, I see how incredibly talented they are, how smart they are, what kind of skills they have, what kind of gifts they can bring beyond the arts. I see artists who have had injuries, maybe a dancer who is in their mid 30s and is done with their dance career, but then what should they do? And, rather than wait tables, drive an Uber, answer phones, I think artists should understand that there is a whole world of value and possibility open to them. I'm not saying artists should leave the arts, but there are many reasons why an artist needs a second career or a second act. And I think they should know about the possibilities so that they see what's out there. So that's from the art side. And from the corporate side, I think they're just missing out on incredible talent. I think there is a sense that, for instance, people who've had a professional sports career bring gifts to the workplace. There's a sense that people who've had a military career bring certain skills and gifts to the workplace. But it really isn't on the radar that people with an arts background also have gifts to bring to the workplace. And, I really want people to understand that this is a pool of talent that needs to be explored. And it's right there. I mean, it's right there. So I think that's an answer to what you asked.
I completely agree with what you're saying. And I love the parallel that you're making with there's these other fields where they're done with their career or something happens, it's clear, oh, well, they're an athlete, they're also a leader. And so we can, do that, right? Or, oh, they understand the strategy so they can actually talk about it and vocalize it as a commentator. We don't have this way of thinking or this vernacular for other folks and in the creative artist world. So let me ask you this, and you kind of spoke to it earlier when you're talking about the skills that creatives possess. But if I'm resistant to this idea, I'll just be like, yeah, we totally need more creativity. And so let me teach people creativity who I currently have, because I love that they have this background because, oh, by the way, their background looks like mine and it makes me feel comfortable. Like, so what would you say to folks who are like, well, why don't we just teach creativity? And then we'll bring in the artist to like do some classes versus like actually bring in the artist background, as an employee. Like, what would you say to that pushback?
So, first of all, it's obvious from what I've been saying that I think creativity is not a weekend skill. It's not something you can get from a workshop or, paint and sip as, fun as those evenings are. Like, this is not where you learn creativity. But I'd like to also say that it is something that can be learned by anybody at any point in their career or life, but it takes a commitment. So, what I would say to, let's say, someone in corporate is if you are serious about this, then start a creative personal practice yourself so you understand more about this. I mean, learn pottery, learn an instrument, start taking writing lessons and write your memoirs or a novel and stick with it. And it's the day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year application of this discipline that really helps you understand what creativity is about. It's not something that you sort of bring in from the outside, make a big splash about, and then it's done with. It has to be really integrated. And I think the way to start is to understand it yourself. So I think that's something that every person in corporate can do. And it doesn't take a huge amount of time. It takes a continued application of this. And of course, it's incredibly rewarding.
Oh, yes. I love that. Okay. So that's tip number one, right? Like you want to bring more creativity in your workforce, start with yourself. Love that. What else for folks who might be in positions to have conversation? Like, what else can people do? They're just loving what you're saying, Ben. They're like, yes, this is what we need. This makes so much sense. Like, what are the steps that folks can take as leaders or as influencers in their organizations to say, I want to bring this idea forward because I think it would really be game changing? What can they do?
Well, I've talked about looking again at your recruiting process and making sure that it isn't knocking out people with a different background just because their resume doesn't look like everyone else's resume. So I think that's number two, is taking a hard look and seeing whether your process is creating problems for the sort of people that you might want to bring in. I think that's number two. Number three is hiring what I call a translator. So making a first hire. Let's say you like this idea. You want to bring in someone who understands storytelling, right? So you find someone with a theater background. I think if you make one hire in that area and it turns out well, what you've done is you've created an on-ramp because these people know other people with the background and they can also begin to translate what those skills are like for corporate and for the arts. They can be that sort of translator that connects two people speaking different languages. So I think these are three things that are very actionable that you can do.
Oh my gosh, it makes so much sense. That it makes me think of the way that things are organized already, right? In many organizations, which is you have translator roles, right? Like you have account managers that are the go between the business leader, let's say, and the creatives, on the agency side, or even if it's internal, right? But you have folks that can speak both languages, and maybe it's like the account manager on the accounting side, even, right? Like,
That's right.
so, right, because we there's often a need to bridge that gap because that gap can be really big. And so finding the folks that understand both worlds, and to your point about looking at the practices in place, which means, it may not be the algorithm looking at the resumes, right? Like, or you have to change that algorithm, or you have to look for different keywords, you have to look for different experiences. But I think as much as we're automating these recruiting practices, like we've got to put the humans back in looking at things and sensing things. I don't know if you think that that's part of it, but I'm curious what you think.
Oh, I'm a huge proponent of putting humans back in the loop. I think AI is incredibly powerful and it will be, for going forward, but it doesn't take the place of judgment. And I think if a company really wants to do something different, wants to find new people who come in with new ideas, you can't expect a machine to do that. So there has to be some way to bring people into the loop. Now, maybe a person can't go through 15,000 digital resumes. I totally get that. But I think there should be a separate pathway for, let's say, a translator, someone who is already an employee at an organization, to bring in people from their background who understand the world from a different lens. And I think these things are possible. We have to figure out a new way going forward.
Yeah, and you know what you just made me think of, because we're talking about, like, you bring in these folks, but also how do we make sure they're supported?
Mhm.
Right? Like, how do we make sure that they can thrive in this environment? Because they might just be one of 100. And that goes for anybody, right? Anytime you're bringing, oh, this is the outlier, in air quotes. So, do you have thoughts on, like, well, once you bring them in, we talked about like the translator piece, but, I'm thinking about like employee resource groups, right? There's ERGs for different types of folks. Is it that type of thing? Like, is it an internal community that supports these different ways of thinking so that they get the respect and support they need? Like, what are your thoughts around? Well, how do you then nurture the new talent that you're bringing in?
Sure. I mean, look, it would be great to have an internal group at a company that specifically understood people with an artistic or humanistic background. I think that's probably unlikely given the numbers we're talking about. But I think there are other things that can be done. For instance, I think there could be internship programs for people who come from an arts or humanities background to get them speaking the language, understanding what a certain corporate culture is like, sort of providing that on ramp to come in. I mean, we have that for various other disciplines, other types of work. I don't see why we couldn't do that going forward. It would take an investment, but I think it can be done.
Makes sense. All can be done. Let's just be clear, right? We put the barriers in front of ourselves about
Right.
what can and can't be done. Just taking a pause. I know we've covered a lot of ground. We've kind of zigged and zagged a bit, but like, where do you want to go now? Like, what is it that you want to share that maybe hasn't been said about this topic?
Well, as a writer, as a journalist, the thing that fires me up is finding new stories about people I've never met. And it's really inexhaustible. There are always new stories to be told, new people to meet, new models to be explored. So that's, me in my journalistic hat. I think as someone who's interested in talent, I think we have to consider what processes there are around bringing people in from different backgrounds. As we talked, maybe there's a way to create an onboarding situation. Maybe there's a group at a company. Maybe there's an internship program. I think it's all a process and movement towards something. I don't think this happens overnight. I think it takes a acknowledgement that there are opportunities here from both sides and just trying things out. So I'd like to be on the leading edge of seeing what's possible with that.
Oh, you know what? I love that. You talked about it is a movement, and what a double entendre, right? Like
Yes.
for the movement. I think we could I think there's some really fun personal branding work we can do here. But you are at the forefront of creating a movement, of thinking in yet another new way of the talent pool, about how we're looking at it. And I think in the process, like lifting up a group of folks in this country, especially, but I think in a lot of places around the world that are overlooked or underestimated in terms of where the capabilities are and the capacity is for growth. And I love that, like bringing in hope and possibility for folks who maybe don't even know that possibility exists because the worlds are so far apart. And
That's
I
right.
think and I think that what you're inspiring in me is to say, not only how do I help lift other folks up who maybe aren't thinking about what else is possible for their talent and for the monetization of that, but also what are the skills within me that I might be diminishing because dominant culture doesn't reward that or doesn't measure it or it's immeasurable, right? To go back, full circle. And I think this is such a dynamic topic that has many different lenses that we can use to look at it.
Absolutely.
So what are you hoping the person listening today, like what are you hoping they do as a result? Like what is that action that you hope that they take because they've listened to Ben Wolff get on his soapbox and and share some new thoughts.
So I'll divide this into two answers. So let's say there's someone who is in the arts. They're an artist, or they have someone in the arts in their family, and they're thinking, well, what should I do next? So I would say take the time to try and articulate what skills you have in terms of what corporate America needs. And this is not an easy thing. It's not an obvious thing, but it can be done. And it can often be done with the help of someone who is in corporate, who will work with you to translate, to give words to something that maybe you don't have the words for, but you feel that is in you. So that's for the artist. And second, for the corporate world, is really two things, one of which I talked about early, which is to take on a creative personal practice, like go for it, study pottery, take a painting class, do it seriously. And the second is to really consider that when you bring in a creative, as they call it, when you hire someone to come in to be creative for you, you could actually have these people as part of your organization. And they don't have to wear the hat of creative. They could be in any part of your organization. They could be an engineer. They could be an accountant. They could be a financial advisor. And yet they bring these skills with them from their training, from a different life that they've experienced. So I think those are the two areas that I think people should really think about and what I'd love them to take away from this.
And I'll add another one, which is pick up Ben's book for more case studies and examples, because that's what you do, right? You're helping share stories about when these worlds collide and the value that it brings. And so if you want to dive deeper into understanding the benefits and seeing real life scenarios where there was out of the box thinking about talent, check out Ben's book and the link will be in the show notes for sure. So I'll just, I'll plug that.
Thank you.
um,
Thank you.
my pleasure. This was really great. Like, and this is a really big topic, and there's lots of legs, but I really do feel like we've covered some great ground to get, plant some seeds about how to think differently about talent, about how to think differently about your own talents. I love your suggestion of pick up a creative activity and get curious about it. Not only just get curious about like the output and what you're creating, but actually it's really about the process. What does it take to do
That's
that?
right.
And and the thing that I think first and foremost about picking up something new is what it takes is courage to be terrible at it and to be okay with it and to not actually do it well, but just to do it, just for the process of it and to learn and grow, which easier said than done. I have a whole story about when I tried to do that myself after I quit one of my jobs. It was a disaster.
Mm.
But it was a disaster because I had this idea of, well, I have to be good at it. It's like,
Right.
no, you don't. So yeah, and I know that you're on LinkedIn. We'll have that in the show notes too. If folks want to be paying attention to your writing and journalism as a Forbes contributor, I think they can start right with your LinkedIn. Or is there any other place that they can go for that?
Yeah, I think the easiest thing is just to go to my website, bwolff.com. I have all my information there. You can link to the book there. You can find my Forbes articles. If you want to go directly to Forbes, just put my name in and Forbes, and I'll pop right up there. Or find me on LinkedIn and just say, you heard me on this wonderful podcast, and I'd be glad to connect and start a conversation.
Amazing. All right. So my last question for you is, what's next? What's next for you as you spread this message? Like, I just like to throw the dream out there, because if somebody's listening and is like, yes, like I can actually help and support Ben with that. Like, what is it you're looking to do with your thought leadership and with this way of thinking about talent?
There are many answers to that. I think for the purpose of where we are right now, I would really love to bring this into companies and organizations and present it as a real possibility when they're thinking about talent. And I have a presentation that I do, which involves me also playing the cello, which is always fun, and talking about this and telling some of the stories that I've researched and found out about in my Forbes articles. I'm really open to that. And then there are many other things, but I think that's a good start.
Yes. Perfect. Great. I always like to, I know, Ben, you're a little humble.
Mhm.
You're not into the self
Mhm.
promotion as much. So I'm so glad that you shared that, because I think there's going to be someone listening that's going to want to give you a call for that. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And I look forward to all that's to come in the work that you're doing in the world. And I hope we'll get to collaborate again, hopefully soon.
This was such a pleasure, Tosca. Thank you so much.
Wow, I really enjoyed this conversation with Ben. I think he's really got an incredible idea and movement that is so needed right now in our organizations, in any size organization. Honestly, it doesn't matter what size. And I really encourage you, if this was something that you really feel passionate about, reach out to Ben, have a deeper conversation, invite him to come into your organization to share his thoughts. I think that these are the types of things that help us in our career when we can bring in new thoughts, bring in experts, and say, hey, I think we should consider this. It's not only supportive of you and your brand and your reputation in the organization, but it's also supportive of new ideas and folks that are really trying to change the game and change the world. And you know me, I really think there's a lot of work to do to change our workplace environments and our cultures. And right here is a perfect starting point if you didn't know where to start already. Thank you so much for tuning into this podcast. I'm so glad you're here. If there's something that you took away from this episode or any of my episodes, I would so appreciate that you like, rate, review this podcast on whatever platform you're listening on. This goes a very long way in making sure other people can listen to these thought leadership concepts like the one I'm talking about today with Ben Wolff. Thanks again for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Unlock Lab. Ciao for now.